ReefDudes is sponsored by Ecotech Marine and Bulk Reef Supply. Today we're talking top reefer mistakes. What's going on, guys? Devin from ReefDudes. Now, over the years, I've made my fair share of mistakes. I'm sure most of you have as well. And if you're a new reefer, hopefully this will help prevent you from making some of these mistakes. So today we're going to dig into some of the top mistakes of a reefer. And one of the first ones that bit me in the butt in the early days of reefing was using too much GFO. Now, GFO is very aggressive at removing phosphates. And, you know, as a new reefer, you see algae in your tank, you get scared, you want to remove it. You don't want it to turn into some big issue. Now, it is good to nip stuff in the butt, but again, you gotta take it of more of a graceful approach. GFO is a fantastic tool, but you gotta use it in moderation. Too much GFO can absolutely strip the phosphates from your tank. Now, phosphates are very important for coral growth, and if you have tons of encrusting corals like acroporas and there's no phosphates, they're gonna pale out and they will slowly perish. So, number one, don't overdo GFO, use it in moderation. The next one on the list is not making corrections too quickly. If you test something on your tank and it's way out of whack, you know, everyone has that instant, you know, inkling to correct it right away. You know, your alg could drop to 7 from 9 and all of a sudden you want to do a big dose and get right back up there. But big changes can actually harm your tank more than help it. Generally that change happens gradually. So you want to gradually put it back up. You know, instead of doing your corrective dose in one day, maybe split it up over 2 or 3 days. And it's going to ease your tank back into it, and it's going to be less of a shock and impact on your tank. Now, this also goes for things like maintenance. For an example, I know one guy who, on his tank, he almost crashed and lost a bunch of coral from this because he did too much too fast. On the tank, he did a massive water change. He added a ton of fresh carbon to his tank. And he also replaced all of his T5 bulbs. That probably was close to doubling his par. Now, if you think about it, if your tank hasn't had any maintenance in a while, there's going to be a lot of organics in the water. There's going to be a lot of yellowing pigments, and those are going to reduce the light penetration down to your coral. So if you do a big water change, you are reducing those organics, which is going to let more par to your coral. You add carbon, it's going to absorb those organics, which is again going to let more light to your coral. You change all of your bulbs at the same time on a T5 fixture, again, you probably just added a massive amount of par, and again, you start bleaching out your corals. So if you are going to do certain things on your tank, it's probably better to, you know, pick something each week and ease it into it rather than try and do everything all at once. Now, speaking of lighting, when you add a new fish to the tank, it's always a good idea to turn off the lights when you do it. If all your fish are out and about, you add your new fish, they can stress out the new fish. You know, some of them might be up, you know, picking at it or harassing a little bit if there's a territory thing. Where you turn the lights off, most of your fish are going to go and hide in the little cubbies. You can add the new fish and give them some time to settle in first, rather than all the fish kind of bombarding at once. So again, if you add new fish, always a good idea to turn off those lights first. Another big one is considering the placement of your ATO and probably using a siphon break. So if your ATO is the same level as your sump, pumping it up and over and the water's falling in, not an issue. However, if your ATO is higher than your tank or using a larger container, once the water starts flowing, it's going to keep flowing because it's going to create a siphon. So using a siphon break, one, making sure your output tube is above the water line is the first step. Secondly, I also like to use a little connector with a little hole in it inside my containers, just so it lets air into the line and will break that siphon. So one funny story with one of my buddies, if you're watching, when he was way over at my wedding, he had a 55-gallon barrel or a 35-gallon brute, whatever it was, beside his sump for his ATO to, you know, make sure the tank was fine for the couple weeks when he was gone. ATO kicked on, created a siphon, and it kept on flowing and flowing and flowing until the ATO and the sump equalized. Thankfully, it didn't overflow. He was literally a couple millimeters from the brim of his sump, but that's how close it was. So again, having a siphon break will let a bit of air into the line and prevent that from happening. Now, as a new reefer, we generally start out with easy corals, and that's a good thing. Soft corals, you don't have to worry about as much for testing and all your parameters. So, you know, starting something with like a leather coral is super duper easy, and you're gonna have success with it. You know, looking at stuff like mushrooms and zoas. Now, eventually, a lot of people tend to get into acropora, and the consideration with this is you might not always take out those leathers. So if you're starting to do SPS and acros in your beginner reefer, it is highly recommended to remove those leathers. Now, because the leathers actually release a toxin that can inhibit the growth of the acros, sometimes kill them, and it creates a bit of coral warfare in the tank. And lots of new reefers don't consider this one. So if you're just starting out, it's just recommended to remove those leathers when you start going to an SPS tank. Now, that being said, you can run carbon, you can run ozone, break it down, but there's a lot more complications and things to consider to try and run a full mixed reef with the leathers and acros. But that being said, if you're a new reefer, I would highly recommend starting out with the softer corals because it makes your life easier. You know, zoas are awesome, rock flowers are awesome, mushrooms, as long as they're not too invasive, are a good one. Lots of really easy ones that aren't as finicky about your elk and your calcium and kind of make you more successful when you start the hobby, which is always a big win. Now, another common mistake I see is you add a new acro to your tank, it's not as happy, so next week you move it somewhere else. You know, next week it's still not happy and you move it somewhere else. And you're like, oh, a week later, still not quite happy, you move it somewhere else. So moving a new coral too frequently doesn't give it time to settle it in. And by moving it all around constantly, you're actually just prolonging that period. So when you get a new coral in your tank, again, if you don't know where it came from, it is a good idea to start lowering your tank with less par. But you also got to consider every time you move it, it has to readapt to that location. You know, the par is different, the lighting is different, the flow is different. So give your coral time to settle in before you start moving around trying to find a spot to make it happier. And last but not least, one I'm very guilty of is overcomplicating things. So, reefer mistake, overcomplicating it. Keep it simple. There is so much stuff we add onto our tanks, and the majority of it we probably don't need. There's a lot of stuff that makes your life easier, right? Now, if you're starting out, you're fresh, keep it simple. Over time, you can figure out what adds value to you and decide what you want to add on. But the basics, you know, you got your light, your pump, a heater, and if you're just starting out, that's it. That's all you really need to start out. If you are getting more into coral, eventually you're gonna have to look at dosing, and you got to worry about calcium, alkalinity, magnesium. Now, if you have soft corals, not a big deal. You can ignore that, just do water changes for a while. If you start adding corals with a skeleton, like LPS or SPS, then you got to start looking at those. And then eventually you might get into the level where you're gonna start looking at trace elements and whatnot. But again, if you're just starting out, super basics, stick to your water changes, stick with nice easy coral start out, and you'll be successful. Now, if you've made any of these mistakes, let me know in the comment below. I know I've made tons of them myself, and you're always learning as a reefer. So hopefully this helps somebody. All right guys, as always, if you enjoyed it, hit that like button. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.